Hello, and welcome to Gifted Underachievers, the podcast for mid-level creatives with delusional ambition. In this segment, we start out talking about what makes us think our creative work matters. And guess what? Things get kind of deep. Hope you enjoy.
Hey, Pat.
Yes, James.
Well, I'm just coming up from the marketing department at Gifted Underachievers Clubhouse.
Oof.
And what a painful experience that was.
Yeah.
All those are watched these little Seth Godin clips.
Oof.
Come up with these trite little sayings, and nothing seems to get done.
Well,
nothing is getting.
Yeah, they don't do much, do they, down there?
No, there's a lot of activity. They're a beehive. It's a beehive down there. A lot of energy, a lot of heat, but no fire, no flame.
Well, because they're just trying to market something. They're not actually producing it.
Right. And they're not thinking deeply, I believe.
Oh, okay.
I really think about from a creative's perspective, right? There is what we call, there is a marketplace of creativity. No matter what you do, there's a marketplace for it. Right.
True.
And obviously there's creatives who create for the sake of it, and whether somebody looks at it or, plenty of people who write short stories never send them out, paint paintings, never do much with them. They just appreciate what they do. And that's very well and good. But to those of us who want to build careers or have careers, we've got to think about the marketplace. And one of the thoughts that I was having was differentiation.
Right.
How do you differentiate yourself? And it's both sides, the creative adjacent and the core creative work. So for me, how do I differentiate myself as a ghostwriter, or how do I differentiate myself as a short story writer or novel writer? Right. And so it seems to me that then the core question that I have to ask myself is, why do I matter as a creative?
Why do you matter? Wow. Okay. Yeah. And have you come up with an answer about why you matter?
I think that's, part of it, I think, is that's what we're constantly doing, right? Coming up with like the next sentence or the next story or the next painting or the next whatever is really about staying as far away from cliche, stereotype, meaningless, frivolousness, all those kinds of things. And so I think there's also an aspect of this that is really about understanding, who we are at our core as creators, right? And so for me as a short story writer, novelist, I've written about a lot of different things, but right now what I'm doing is really thinking about life as, suburban middle class person. And it's, there's all these angsts, there's all these, things that happen, and, ways that we think about ourselves and ways that we avoid doing what we should be doing and mistakes that we make, and, all these different kinds of things. And so that's what I'm looking at as a short story writer. It's why do I matter? It's because I'm trying to shine a light on, how most of us live, and how most of go, not so much go about the day in terms of like, get up, go to work, go to the store, but, how do we find meaning in that life? And what does that mean to, others and our relationships? How do we connect with other people? How do we connect with other people who are experiencing largely what we're experiencing? And what happens when a pebble falls in that pool, right? The placid pool, and how we react to it. And so it could either be finding out, gee, one of the kids has a severe eating disorder, or wow, I've been living this life and I can tell you precisely what is in our refrigerator and our cabinets. Wow. But I cannot tell you what I did yesterday.
Yeah.
It's, what you and I have been through, uh, dealing with a difficult elderly parent while trying to maintain work and relationships and kids and all these kinds of things. So it's
Yeah.
so that I feel like, to me, that stuff matters. It's important to people because
Okay.
I guess there's a certain bit of that. If it's important to me, it should be important to other people. So that's one answer that I have.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would ask you.
Yeah. Why do I matter? Okay, well, it's a tough one for me because I don't think I do matter as a creative to anybody but myself when I'm creating stuff. So here was my most recent experience with the novella I got published 2024. It was really fundamentally about homelessness, about three people living in the city, my city of Vancouver, where the cost of housing is completely disproportionate to what normal people earn, normal working class people. And so, when I was writing it, it was really just about me and my experience. Not, it wasn't about me, but it was for me. I was writing it for myself to sort of unpack or, understand or get some kind of story out of this meaningful experience I had where I was paying rent and paying a mortgage at the same time on two different places because I was going through a difficult personal period where I was getting separated and then ultimately divorced. And the only reason I knew it actually mattered was when it was a finalist for the City of Vancouver Book Award and it was shortlisted for the George Rigo Award, both of which were focused around inequity.
Mhm.
Um, and so housing inequity is a big issue around here. And I didn't, I was just telling a story, informed by my own experience of finding it very difficult to make ends meet when I was paying a lot for housing. And it struck a chord. The only reason I knew it struck a chord was because it got shortlisted for a couple of awards. Otherwise, I don't think I would have known it mattered. You can tell from sales, I guess. So I don't know if I'm thinking about this the right way. I think if
Well, I
first of
don't
all,
think there's a wrong way.
yeah, I think you have to matter to yourself first. Like, I mean, I don't mean you as a person, although that's obvious, I guess. When you're doing something creative, whether it's your paid work or your own personal creative work, which sometimes gets paid for and sometimes doesn't, I would say if you find meaning in it, then that is all you need to have it matter.
Mhm.
And if the people, obviously, if it's paid work, the people you're working with find meaning in the work that you're doing together, whether it's helping their book become better or creating their book from scratch or whatever you're doing, then that's all that matters. And also, I find teaching quite creative. And I think when I get feedback from students and I ask them for feedback about what the impact the course had on them, through a variety of metrics, basically, I understand whether it did what it was intended to do. And then that's how I judge whether it mattered or not, really. And then after that, once it's out in the world, you only find out when you matter as a creative through whether people are reading your stuff or watching your
Mhm.
dances or whatever. And so I think the first internal mattering has to come first because that's sometimes all you get with many projects in a row. You can go project after project without ever really seeing it get out into the world because of different reasons.
Mhm.
And if it if none of those matter, they have to matter to you first, because if they don't matter to you and you're doing them and they don't matter to anybody else either, there's almost no reason to keep doing them.
Yeah, I mean, definitely if you're going to be a creative, you have to accept the fact that there's going to be a high failure rate for every individual piece that you do.
Yeah, monetarily, there absolutely will be, but as long as it mattered to you when you were making it, then it's not a failure.
Right. And so, when I think about, my reason for why I feel like I matter as a short story writer, novelist, um, it's obviously it's something that's personal to me, right?
Yeah.
Because I grew up as a kid in a very suburban kind of atmosphere, and I hated it. It was
Yeah.
claustrophobic. Just I could not wait to get away from it and get out of it.
Yeah.
And I learned, early on that if I wrote about that though,
Mm-hmm.
that one, it created, it helped, it was like a release for me to write about whatever my frustrations were, but also it felt kind of good to render it in a creative way as opposed to just bitching about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when people read it, it mattered because it influenced them or it affected them in some way. And so I
Yeah.
think like that, when I put anything out and anybody reads it, they go, wow, this, and they sort of have their interpretation of it. I remember, this friend of mine read the story that I wrote about, these parents who kind of recognize that their daughter has an eating disorder, and they're avoidant. They don't want to deal with it because it's
Mm-hmm.
hard. It gets in their way. And it's not that they don't love their daughter or anything, but they just don't want to deal with it in the moment. And
Yeah.
this guy got so upset. He's like, "Why aren't they doing anything? How
Yeah.
could these people not be doing anything?" And he took it as such a like this was real life,
Yeah.
you know,
That's great.
something I had made
Right.
up. And so, that feels pretty cool when you
Yeah.
can provoke a response
I'll
without,
say.
intentionally being provocative. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so I think that feels good. But like you said, it comes from our own, want to do something that's interesting to us
Mm-hmm.
and that feels like it matters to us.
Yeah.
But, I think to go a little bit beyond that, asking this question in a routine and structured kind of way, I think could
Yeah.
really be helpful in terms of just really trying to gain perspective on what is it that I'm doing? What is it,
Yeah.
I care about? Why does, why does it matter to me? Or if it matters to me, why should it matter to somebody else? And it's almost like you do a very good job in your creative adjacent business of having these regular kind of business meetings with yourself,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? And I think it's good to have not these, it's good to have those business meetings, but I think adding in sort of just creative meetings, periodically
Yeah.
every 4 months or something, just to sort of say, all right, not just how is it going, but do I feel like this is meaningful? Is it
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
impactful?
I like that. And you can see a thread too if you look back at your stuff that you've created um, on your own time. It's there's definitely a thread, and I would say sometimes your stories, like the idea of how you felt when you were trapped in suburbia. That's a classic fish out of water story. You felt like you were in the wrong place, and that's isn't
Mhm.
Superman a fish out of water or a stranger in a strange land? If
Yeah.
like it's sort of a time honored story framework, an idea that it really
Mhm.
makes a ton of sense because so many people do, I think, feel alienated from the place they live in or the people they're around, and so that resonates with people. I love stories about stranger in a strange land. I love stories about people who are trying to do something that really can't be done, or people that kind of they start out feeling very powerless and they end up becoming empowered through the story, and that sounds like an asshole way to describe it, but it's like there's this, oh my god, there was this really actually quite a terrible novel. I read it again a few years later and I was like, oh god, this incredibly misogynistic, The Eiger Sanction,
Uh-huh.
where it got made into a movie, I think, with Clint Eastwood. Anyway, the guy starts out as a particular type of person, and he's forced by circumstances to become
Mhm.
incredibly fit and physically fit, right? And it puts him through all this stuff. I'm sure I'm telling the story like the weirdest angle on the story, but my point is, I really love it when people are forced in stories to become a different version of themselves in order to cope with what's happening, or a better version of themselves to cope with what's happening. And I'm like, for some reason, that's not what I write. That's what I like to read. I'm also seeing a thread that, through my own stuff about outsiders. It's just being an outsider in society for whatever reason, and how you can be comfortable with that position, because you got to be comfortable. If you're an outsider, you're never going to be comfortable. You got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, basically. So that's the kind of stuff that appeals to me, that I like thinking about, that you can think about in any number of ways. And there's a lot of history. Sometimes I think it's meaningful just to be part of the conversation in any kind of writing. So the novel I'm working on now, it's quite Gothic. It's got all these Gothic themes: inheritance, family, outsiderness, the nun who isn't a nun, the monk who isn't a monk, like stuff like that. That's not literally what's in there, but it's kind of a Frankenstein novel. So there's disfigurement. And it can be internal or external, right? It's this idea that you don't belong for whatever reason, and that just floats my boat. And so,
Yeah. Well,
that's
and
a thread.
so I would ask, is that coming from a personal sense of being the outsider and trying to find
No,
your,
I don't know if it is, like, 'cause I don't really feel. I mean, as a kid, sure, I felt, like I was a bit of a weirdo, but I was also one of four kids, and we were all kind of weird. So it didn't, it didn't bother me. And I loved being alone, and I loved reading, and I didn't have any problem with being a bit weird. And I had friends, right? I had quite a lot of friends. So throughout my life, I've always had friends. So I don't know that I personally feel like an outsider. I actually feel like I don't really understand people. I look at the world now, I look at, like, the pedophiles in office, and I'm like, I don't get it. I don't get why anybody
yeah,
voted for them. I don't get why nobody's gotten rid of them yet. I understand
yeah,
there's reasons for the political system and stuff, but I don't get it. And people seem often quite strange to me, but I don't feel like I'm not one of them. I just don't feel like I'm like them, I guess. So maybe there's
yeah.
that thread, but maybe we all feel that way from time to time.
Yeah, I don't know. It's so one of the stories that's part of this novel that I'm working on, what the sort of the protagonist character is a woman who puts huge amounts of effort into trying to absolutely fit in, but also be the core social uh not just person, but her home of their circle of friends, right?
Right, right.
And so, she can be manipulative, but she can also be manipulative in a way that she wants to serve somebody.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, yeah, so it really reflects, I think it reflects like what you're talking about, which is it's about these human relationships, how we interact with other people, and how we feel that other people are also kind of odd.
Yeah, yeah. They're who you're with, right? You've got to do your best to understand other people. And for me, the way I do that is writing. I just find it very interesting and understand my own experience. So, and being part of the conversation is when I read a book, or when I'm working on a book, if I decide it's Gothic, I read all the Gothic classics and the New Gothic. I read as much as I can in that realm, because then you can bounce off, some of the themes, and it does become a little bit, maybe too insular, because there's this idea, genre, it's got to hit all the marks. Romance has to have a happily ever after. Uh, Thrillers have to have, really big stakes and a tight time frame and all this stuff. So you can get a little too hung up on that, and that can fuck up your writing pretty substantially if you
Yeah.
over rely on some of the things that you're seeing in other type books of the same type you're writing.
Yeah, the
But
trope.
yeah, tropes, and there's nothing wrong with them. Sometimes they can help give you marks to hit, in terms of, okay, well, that's cool because that's part of this. That's part of this type of book. And so you're thinking about the reader's experience. Readers don't read romances to have it end in tragedy. I mean, that's why Romeo and
Mhm.
Juliet isn't a romance, it's a tragedy.
Yeah.
So, like, you certain times it can guide your thinking in a positive way, and at other times it can become a little too overly referential and it can hamstring you. So I just think it's, for me, I want to produce something that's uniquely me. Only I could have written it, and also that's having a conversation with other books, for
Yeah.
whatever I choose. It doesn't have to be. It can be Pessoa, the Portuguese guy who they found 30,000 pieces of paper in a trunk, and it was all just weird shit. And I'm having a conversation with him sometimes when I'm writing a book. It's like, or when I'm
Yeah.
writing a fragment of a book. So it doesn't really. I'm not saying, I don't know what I'm saying. I'm saying it matters because you're part of a tradition. You're part of a tradition.
Yeah, no, I like it. And it got me to thinking, and thinking more broadly about creatives is, the next question is, is the first question is, why do I matter as a creative, right?
Yeah, right.
And then maybe the next question is, what conversation am I trying to have?
Yeah. Or do you feel part of?
Yeah. Well,
Because
yeah,
you're
I
not,
mean,
yeah.
well, as the person doing the creating,
Mm.
you're you're in control,
Yeah.
right?
Well, here's what I think. When you're part of a conversation, you're not in control. So what I would say, you're in control of your own project. About, I would say, what stream of conversation am I operating within? Under
Mhm.
my own guidelines, under my own personal agency.
Mhm.
What am I part of? And so you could say, what am I trying to have? It's probably a similar way of saying the same thing. I just feel like the word trying doesn't need to
Yeah.
be there. What conversation am I having?
Right. Yeah, because you're in the act of creating, so you are actually having
You're
and
having a
I'm thinking
conversation.
more about, with the audience, the viewer,
Oh, I see what
uh,
you're saying. Okay, yeah.
and trying to engage them. And
Mm.
what is this, conversation really, really about? And it's like, it's cool because, so I would say do you trend towards more genre fiction? Would that be
I
accurate?
don't know. I have
You don't
no
know?
idea.
Okay.
As a reader, I would say yeah, but I also like literary fiction. I read a lot of shit, and as a writer, I don't know. I can't tell you because
Yeah.
I haven't written a genre book. Actually, I've
Yeah.
never. I guess
That,
historical. I've written historical fiction, but I've never
yeah.
written a
No.
genre book.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, like, one of my favorite stories is I think it's called My Brother by John Cheever. And it's just about this family on a Martha's Vineyard kind of like island. And some of them get along, but there's the brother that shows up who can't fit in. He's the outsider of the family.
Right.
But it's also about pretenses, right? So they're
Mm.
kind of faded glory, but they're not willing to really, sort of admit it, and all these different kinds of things going on that kind of spoke to me. But then the other short story, and it's the one that really caught me as a kid, is A Clean, Well Lighted Place by Hemingway, which stereotype, I know, cliche, but that story of his, where most of his stories are about going hunting and there's conflict and there's this kind of stuff, is really about capturing a moment and a very atmospheric moment
Mm.
of being alone in this bar and just noticing everything that's around the character, right?
Yeah. Mm.
And for some reason, those really spoke to me.
Yeah.
And I feel like, you know, Cheever is saying, I want to have a conversation with you about how complex family relationships can be.
Mm-hmm.
And Hemingway is saying, I want to have a conversation with you about slowness and
Mm.
observing detail and little things and
Right.
taking appreciation for that.
Yeah.
And so I think it's worth asking ourselves those similar kinds of questions. I don't think, either Cheever or Hemingway were necessarily thinking that, explicitly about it, but I think these kinds of questions to ask ourselves and conversations to have are really important.
Yeah. It's a good point. I like that. Yeah. Why wouldn't you? I mean, if you were aware of the fact that you could have those kinds of conversations with yourself, then
Mhm.
it makes sense to do it because it'll give you more context and it'll help direct some of what you're producing.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's a check-in. And then when you do it with somebody else, as we are here, we're asking ourselves the same questions, but you're coming up with a completely different, well, maybe not completely, but a very different interpretation and way of thinking about it that is
Mm.
absolutely legitimate and particular to you. And I, from what I'm having, which is just as legitimate and particular to me, you
Yeah,
know?
true, right? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it is.
So,
It's like your operating system is your operating system. And so what matters to you is it's so individual, and even what sphere it operates in with the things that matter to you and how you
mhm,
view them, it's very individual. It's like interior monologue, you can't, if it's everybody's the same, then there's no world. It's and that's
mhm.
what's so beautiful about art. Everything is an expression of somebody's interior.
Yeah, yeah. That got me to thinking so the movie Back to the Future, right? Fun
Yeah,
movie, enjoyable,
yeah.
all that kind of stuff. And I'm gonna space the actor's name, but the original actor who they hired to play Marty McFly, I think it
Mm.
was the protagonist's name, took, he when he thought about that character going back to the future, he saw it as like disconnection and
Oh.
lonely and like the pain of not feeling part of a family that understood him. And he had a very sort of emotional kind of way of portraying the character.
Hmm.
And the director's like, this isn't working.
Yeah.
So they said, I'm sorry, but the way that you're perceiving this character just is not working for this movie. And so
Right.
they bring in, is it Michael J. Fox, I think?
Yeah, yeah.
And and he says, oh, this is about fun and this character just constantly going from one crazy experience to the next. And at his core, he's got the girlfriend and he's trying to get back to his home where he feels connected.
Yeah.
And at the same time, he's able to do things that actually end up benefiting the family in the future, kind of thing. And so he
Hmm.
has a very different, it was much lighter kind of touch.
Yeah.
And that's what made the movie. I mean, if they had just stuck with that one actor, it wouldn't have worked. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, interpretation,
Yeah.
um, see what you feel.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel bad for the original actor because he got fired.
Yeah.
So he probably wasn't too happy about that. But he was playing it the way he saw it.
Yeah. And it was the right decision for the movie. That's one thing about the collaborative arts, which I think many arts are, is, it's got to be the right decision for the project in the end. And so some arts are very much self-directed. Like there's really only one person involved until, up until towards the end when, if it's
Mhm.
writing, you submit it to a publisher or an agent or whatever. But a lot of the time it is more collaborative, stage, screen, music. A lot of that is a shared vision, and so that's what directs the it's not just projects, it's a series of projects with that kind of thing quite often, because people,
Mhm.
they glom onto each other. They're like, yeah, you get what I get and we're going to make it together.
Yeah. But even still, there's room for some interpretation,
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And but anyway, yeah. So
yeah.
back to this, we have these two questions.
Right.
Why do I matter as a creative and what conversation am I trying to have
Yeah, yeah,
with the reader, viewer, observer, what have you? And I think even just having this conversation has been helpful to see, to put words to feelings, to be able to understand them. So yeah.
I agree. And so much for the marketing department. I think they'd have trouble with this one, putting it
Yeah.
into a soundbite. But I do think that it's without this kind of rudder on your ship, doesn't matter how much wind there is out there. If you don't have an inkling of what your direction is, and you don't have a rudder, you don't have this kind of thinking driving your behavior, or at least informing your behavior, maybe not driving it, then your projects, you won't have a sense of forward momentum over the course of years and years and years of producing one thing after another. When I started thinking about writing, so I think I was in my mid-20s when I wrote a book the first time, and then I got like totally obsessed with it, and I wrote a book every 4 years for the rest of my life, basically, and up till now. And somebody said to me once, "Well, what's your goal as a writer?" And I was like, "Huh?" And then I was like, "Well, you know what? I'd like to write 5 different books where the person reading it couldn't tell that it was by the same person." 5 books so different in their tone, voice, and all this stuff that you would never know. And the longer I've been a writer, the longer I realize how difficult that really would be, because there's this underlying sensibility beneath everything, that it's almost impossible to change who you are at that level when you're creating stuff. So but I know visual artists, and I still think technically you could write a bunch of different books in such a different style that people wouldn't necessarily know by reading them just on the surface that they were by the same person. And I worked with an artist named Nina Graniere, and terrific artist. She had a long career, decades long, and the galleries would get frustrated with her. She's successful. However, she wouldn't stick to the same. She'd do something for 10, 15, maybe 10 years, 8, 10 years. And then she'd say, "Okay, I've done that," and change her style, And then, but I went to her retrospective where she was closing down her studio, and over 2,000 pieces of art, that she still had. And although her different styles were completely different, there was this sensibility underlying all of her work, just in the focus of it and what she drew and painted and all that stuff. So it was, it's kind of interesting actually to think about it that way.
Yeah. There's always a red thread.
And
you think about successful painters or authors and a lot of actors, right? Like Jack Nicholson is always Jack Nicholson, right?
True. Yeah.
And Edward Hopper or Andrew Wyeth are always, they have this very sort of thematic thing. And then you think about, other writers, I'll bring up John Irving. They have a certain, even though they can write completely different stories, you're going to have a sense, or, create different images. You're going to have a strong sense of who this is.
Yeah. And you look at, say, Meryl Streep, she can be completely different in different roles, yet she's you can't imitate her. She's always herself. So she's not like such a cartoony actor as Jack Nicholson. She's not tearing up the scenery in every movie she's in, but she's just a very solid chameleon who's still identifiably got this quality of sort of depth and sweetness that's hard to change.
Let's give him a call.
Who?
Meryl Streep.
Oh,
all these people that we've just talked about.
Okay,
and
sure.
Let's ask them these questions.
That's a good idea. Let's do it.
Yeah, I'm going to do that.
Okay, you do it.
All right, give me a few minutes.
Let me know what happens.
All right, I got to run. I got to make some phone calls.
Good luck.
Meryl.
Thanks so much for listening to Gifted Underachievers, the podcast for mid-level creatives with delusional ambitions. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Hope you have a great creative week.